My name is Friedemann Freund. I am associated with the SETI Institute and also with the physics department at San Jose State University, and I would like to present some ideas about how we understand the restlessness that some humans and animals are experiencing prior to earthquakes. There is a steep puzzle why some animals and some people are able to sense the approach of a major earthquake. There are innumerable reports dating back for centuries that this is actually observed many times, that animals and some humans feel restless before major earthquakes. In order to illustrate this, I would like to take you to a far-out region in East Asia. You see here a map of the Himalayan region with the blue arrows indicating the displacement vectors where the Indian continent that collides with the Asian continent is pushing the ground. And you see that the northerly direction of the main thrust of India against the continent is reversing towards a southern direction in the area around on the right, on the eastern side. I'm focusing on this region that is here outmarked by the blue box, and when we look at some phenomenon, namely the apparent temperature of the ground over a period of, in this case, 9 days, day by day, as measured by satellite from the intensity of the infrared emission from the ground. And normally this infrared emission is interpreted as being a direct measurement of the temperature of the ground. And you see there on the top left side that the ground is very hot, particularly in this region, mountainous region that is indicated here by the red color. And the next day, however, the temperature is much lower. The temperature difference measured with this infrared emission appears to be lower by as much as 30 degrees from day to the next day. And then you see the record of the following days that this red blob in the northern left side continues to appear. And the earthquake happened in the lower row in the middle. So these infrared emission maxima observed in this region, general region, precede the earthquake phenomenon, the earthquake event. And the question then is, would it be possible to correlate why and animals and humans feel the approach of earthquake with this infrared emission? And it's certainly not true that the infrared emission temperature is felt by the organisms living on the surface of the Earth. It's not a temperature phenomenon, but it's something more interesting and more complex. Here's a record of, over a period of 13 years, how these infrared anomalies come and go in waves. And you see here there are 4 waves, each lasting several years, in which these infrared emissions frequently occur, and there are in between certain years where there is essentially no infrared activity observed during the entire year. Each of these brightness temperature anomalies occurred incidentally during periods of increased stress in the region that is manifested itself by increased seismicity, that means by increased incidences of small and earthquakes and microseismicity of very small that are insensible to the people, but the effect that is on the human and animal mind appears to be also triggered by seismicity that is imperceptible for us living on the surface of the Earth. The question is, how would the animals and human feel these anomalies in the so-called brightness temperature of the Earth's ground. Well, there's here a record from a period of time in China when a magnitude 8 earthquake happened in the Sichuan region. And incidentally, during this time, there was an ongoing laboratory experiment monitoring the activity of laboratory mice. And as you see here on the left side, the record of days and time of the day. There are two 24-hour periods plotted in the horizontal region, and the vertical region are day after day after day. And you see that the activity of the laboratory mice shifts with the daily activity as expected, and there are a period of activity and then interrupted by rest when the laboratory mice are sleeping. But prior to this Sichuan earthquake, 3 days before, two days before, the mice in the laboratory showed a completely different behavior. They were hiding in a corner and became immobile, and then the earthquake happened at the point marked here by the red circle. Then another 2 days passed and the mice resumed their activity, but much more interrupted than before the earthquake event. So there is definitely something that these laboratory mice are feeling prior to the earthquake on the order of a couple of days. So clearly the mice were able to feel the approaching major earthquake, and we need to look at the processes that happened before earthquake in order to answer this question. So what happens when we stress rocks like nature does prior to earthquakes? And the mineral grains are shifting when the rocks are stressed, and if the stress gets very strong, even the mineral grains will be deforming, and during this process something happens along the grain boundaries or even in the interior of the grains, mineral grains. Well, in order to understand this, we have to realize that, of course, all minerals in the Earth's crust are solidifying, crystallizing in the omnipresence of water, and therefore every rock in the Earth's crust contains hydroxyls and hydroxyl pairs as impurities, even though the minerals are nominally water-free. And these hydroxyl pairs are forming peroxy defects by a mechanism that I describe here in the next slide, that are typically sitting on grain boundaries, and the peroxy forms linking grain boundaries, and therefore the peroxy links become supremely sensitive to stress and to mechanical deformation of the rocks, such as it happens prior to major earthquakes. Now, what is a peroxy bond? In our context, we can call it a sleeping reactive oxygen species, ROS. And the mechanism, the equation below, shows you what is happening inside the rock. On the left side, you see a peroxy bond that is bonding two SiO4 units in the crystal structure with not a single oxygen, but a peroxy bond. And I will come back to how these peroxy bonds are formed. For the moment here, just want to please watch out that if this bond is breaking, and it breaks because during deformation of this bond, an electron is transferred from another oxygen into this peroxy bond, and the other oxygen that has donated this electron into the peroxy bond then becomes a ROS, and this becomes a highly mobile electronic charge carrier that is actually responsible for the electronic conductivity in rocks. It's highly mobile, and it can propagate through the matrix of the rock at relatively high velocity. So this oxygen double minus that has lost one or donated one electron to the peroxy bond then becomes an O single minus, and the oxygen single minus is an electronic defect in the oxygen sublattice. We call it a positive hole. It is a highly mobile, highly reactive charge carrier symbolized by H+. How do these peroxy defects turn into a reactive oxygen species? Here is the mechanism as it is derived by an independent study that started many years ago. So this is a summary of this study. When mechanical deformation occurs, the peroxy bond, either on the grain boundaries, across grain boundaries, or in the matrix of mineral grains, is deformed, and it can be shown quite clearly and clearly that the bending of this peroxy bond causes an electron from a neighboring oxygen to jump into the peroxy bond, and this oxygen that donated the electron then becomes a ROS, namely a highly mobile positive hole charge carriers. And since peroxy are everywhere in all minerals, or in most minerals in the Earth's crust, therefore ROS are everywhere when the rocks are deformed. So why should we be interested in this process? Because once activated, these positive hole charges, now an electronic defect, can travel through the Earth's crust. This is actually the mechanism by which the Earth's crust is electrically conductive, and this is why we, in our daily life, can plug in our electrical appliances in the home, and we have this one plug that is labeled ground that connects to the Earth ground and can dump electrons into the ground or extract holes from the ground. These holes, these defect electrons, are fast. They travel over large distances. They accumulate at the Earth's surface, and they interact with all living organisms, and more so when stresses are building up deep below, activating these charge carriers in large numbers. Now, one thing which is important in the context of our meeting is that reactive oxygen species have been around since the dawn of time, since before life appeared on the Earth. Because normally oxygen exists in the common valence state 2-, that's what we learn in school. However, when oxygen exists in the 1- state, it becomes an electronic charge carrier, highly mobile, and this electronic charge carrier becomes an ROS, a reactive oxygen species. These ROS, here symbolized by H dot, travel through the Earth's crust at velocities up to about 100 meters per second over tens and hundreds of kilometers when stresses are building up in the Earth's crust. And the question arises, how do these traveling charge carriers affect living things? And the true answer is we don't know yet. We know a lot, but we don't understand it completely. There's still a lot of science to be done. So let me just remind you how the peroxy is formed. The peroxy is formed because all rocks, silicate rocks, feldspars and other minerals in silicate rocks, crystallize in the presence of water, and therefore water dissolves in the mineral structure and forms like you see it here on the right-hand side, hydroxyl, and of course many of these hydroxyls occur as hydroxyl pairs. And then there is this very interesting reaction that the hydroxyl pairs split off a hydrogen molecule inside the crystal structure and forms a peroxy bond. And some of you may know that, for instance, one of the gases, hydrogen is one of the gases that is of great concern in the mining industry because of its explosive nature and have to be narrowly controlled during mining operations. And since hydroxyl defects occur predominantly on grain surfaces, the peroxy bonds are often formed along grain boundaries, and then they are linking grains, and thereby they become supremely sensitive to mechanical deformation that would happen during a pre-seismic activity or deformation into the Earth's crust. Now, peroxy are everywhere in the Earth's ground, and as all rocks are formed in the presence of water, these peroxy are contaminated. The rocks are contaminated with traces of water. Traces of water form hydroxyls, and hydroxyl pairs split off hydrogen and form these peroxy bonds. And we are interested in the behavior and the consequences of these peroxy bonds in the mineral structures. Now, we are also interested in the processes when rocks are weathered, and because during the weathering process, rocks are dissolved, and I remind you that even today, with all the vegetation that we have on the surface of the rock, there are about 3 cubic kilometers of rocks that are dissolved every year by the rain. The rain comes down essentially as a distilled water, and as it hits the ground, it dissolves the rocks in order to become saturated to its saturation limit. And then the minerals that are forming are forming these hydroxyl defects, and these defects, and if the weathering process encounters a peroxy defect in the rocks, they split, they decompose, they form water and release oxygen as a side product. So therefore, since rocks consist mostly of silicates, and the silicates are oxide minerals, and therefore all oxide minerals forming these peroxy defects, and when these minerals dissolve as part of the weathering cycle, they form these peroxy defects, and thereby in the weathering cycle they develop and release rust. Normally, in your community, ROS are generated during the mitochondrial oxidative metabolism, and therefore, and also by the body's response to bacterial activity and bacterial invasion. So therefore, ROS for you is primarily a biological concept, but it may be important for you to keep in mind that ROS not only exists in the biological world, but also in the inorganic, in the mineral world, namely in the form of these peroxy, which then form these positive whole charge carriers that become active during mechanical deformation of the rocks and are responsible actually for the conductivity of the Earth's crust that we use daily in our activity whenever we plug in an electrical appliances that has this one ground plug to connect to the Earth's ground. Now, these positive whole charge carriers are agents that are interacting with living organisms, and the big question is, how do they do this? So far, the answer is that we still don't know it, or only part of it, and the full answer still evades us, but we have already some basic understanding from an interdisciplinary study that I would like to bring to your attention, because this interdisciplinary study was published in papers in journals that are not part of your routine examination. And there are many hypotheses how the Earth acquired oxygen-rich atmosphere, and the most widely promoted but definitely wrong idea that out of the blue early cyanobacteria just invented oxygenic photosynthesis and started to pump oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. It is extremely unlikely that cyanobacteria would develop and produce a gas like oxygen, which is toxic to them, which would kill them and any primitive life. So before they can produce oxygen as a byproduct of their metabolism, they have to learn how to handle oxygen. So in order to learn how to handle oxygen, they had to learn it by living as a living early organism on the surface of rocks and minerals that during the weathering cycle released traces of hydrogen peroxide, and therefore they were trained, they were forced to face the evolution of hydrogen peroxide because it is so highly toxic to them. So what I'm presenting to you here is the outcome of a study that started many decades ago, long before I was interested in these biological processes. I was just studying purely mineral or chemical processes in rocks that result from the incorporation of water as an impurity in minerals. And as part of this study, I became aware of this very interesting and unusual reaction that forms peroxy in rock minerals. And the peroxy then leads to the formation during mechanical deformation, for example, and also during the weathering process, to the formation of hydrogen peroxide. So the living organisms on the surface of the Earth, since the beginning of life, had to learn how to deal with hydrogen peroxide and to either take advantage of it or to metabolize them in some way that would be non-harmful for their existence. So thank you for attention and for giving me the opportunity to present to you this finding from a study that is initially completely separate from organic and biological interests. Thank you.